Hello, dear ones. I'm so mindful that this coming Sunday is Mother's Day. And what I want to talk about in thinking about Mother's Day is the spiritual practice of living with our perfect imperfections. Each one of us can make a list of those shortcomings that we are so aware of. And yet, what's also equally true is that we live with a kind of spiritual perfection, that we are whole. And so living side by side with that is a reality that certainly I feel, especially when it comes to my motherhood. I remember with the birth of each of my children and the arrival of our foster son that my heart grew each time, that I felt a kind of abundant and deep love that was life-changing. I love my children more than life itself. And once they were born, I realized that at some level my life was expendable if it would mean saving theirs. And I love them so profoundly, but what I also know is that even with that abundant love, that I still disappoint them, that I still fall short in my goal to be a really good mother, and that sometimes we have different ideas about what a good mother does and acts like. And so that I'm always learning and trying to navigate that journey with my children about how to be a good and loving mother, and now good and loving grandmother. So I want to share a story with you. Before Rob and I served here at Unity, we served a church in Oakland, California. And on Mother's Day, Rob and I were conducting the service together. And I thought I would share one of my favorite children's book as part of the message for families. And it was the Judith Viorst book, My Mama Says There Aren't Any Zombie Ghosts, Vampires, Creatures, Demons, Monsters, Fiends, Goblins, or Things. But even mamas make mistakes. And I read this book. I had the children come up and I read this book to them. And I thought we would have this wonderful conversation about fears and how mothers can help hold us when we are afraid. But what happened in the conversation that I had with the kids is what they wanted to talk about is all the mistakes that their mothers had made. And in that moment, I lost complete control as the children kept grabbing the mic and standing in front of the congregation and telling us all in great detail mistakes that their mothers had made. And they did so on Mother's Day. And I looked out in the congregation and I saw each of the mothers that were being talked about, slinking deeper and deeper into their chairs. And the kids kept not letting me have the mic. And finally, I was like, I need the mic. It's, come on. And I mean, I had mothers with tears streaming down their faces. And I was so embarrassed. And I just, oh my God, it was so awful. And I finally got the mic back and kind of tried to make my apologies. And I thought that it was over. But the tradition at the Oakland church was always to have a family retreat at one of the weekends in May. And one of the traditions of that family retreat is we would always have a talent show and a skit night. And of course, often those skits were making fun of the ministers. And so it became an annual tradition from that year forward that moment was memorialized, and always they made fun, and the mistakes of mothers got more outlandish and more outlandish and more outlandish. And finally, in our final year of our ministry there, they actually, because my mistake that got lifted up is that I had been setting what's called a fogger, which is an anti-flea spray, and it sprays pesticide that kills the fleas, and it's supposed to be timed so that you can set it and then it goes off after you set it down. But it went off with it still being in my hand, and I had to walk around the house with this awful pesticide spraying off my hand. And my children told this story in vivid detail in front of the congregation, and everyone was laughing except me. And then at the skit, they came in with Ghostbuster costumes as they fumigated the entire congregation with, at that time it was just steam, but to show how ridiculous this moment had been. I tell you this story to remind you that even as much as we try, we still make mistakes. And yet, that mistake making is how we live in that aspiration gap where spirituality lives. We look at who we want to be and who we are. And we live in that aspiration gap of all those ways that we want to make the world whole. And yet we fall short and we make mistakes. And yet we learn from them. I've never shared that story ever again in worship. And I leave with you these lines. And yes, once she said there wasn't any cream cheese for his sandwich, and then he found it underneath the lettuce. And once she said his tooth would fall out on Thursday, and then it stayed till Sunday after lunch. And once he told her chocolate nut, and she brought back rum raisin. Yes, sometimes even mamas make mistakes. But for lots of times that mamas make mistakes, when it comes to demons and fiends and other bedtime terrors, sometimes even mamas can be trusted. So happy Mother's Day.